Hello again, I'm Greg. Welcome back to this mini-series, 4 parts, about the concept of the hero. This is part 2, with its somewhat witty title, Joan of Arkham, this time, Reimagining the Dark Heroine. So a fitting title. We're going to carry on right from where we left off last time and get right into it. The ideal of a female overbeing is almost as ancient as that male. In polytheistic systems, we have set before us a panoply of figures whose métiers are diverse, from Erda, the earth goddess, to Diana or Artemis, the huntress. There are shadows at play from the beginning, for to descend into the depths of the earth requires an internment of the passions. They must be redirected to a singular goal. Eurydice is regained by Orpheus, but their sole mission, when below ground, is escape. The joy of reunion is deferred until the sun can again be seen and felt. And to enter the forest is the above-ground guise of the same descent. Diana, for one, leaves her suitors wounded, their blood attracting the savage animals who are both her usual prey, but also her willing allies in the defense of the goddess's sole preserve. In both types of narrative, it is nature which is feminine and which holds itself aloof. One may entreat the earth and seek its wisdom, but in not following it, and this even to the letter, the hero himself courts disaster. The huntress lives only for the hunt. The only intimacy she knows is conquest, and therefore for the other, death. Even so, we also understand that such figures represent the care of both the earth and its nature. There is a nurturing, however shadowy, occurring, and indeed the male can be seen as a mere transgressor. Diana is, in this sense, the last of her tribe, for in the social contract she would have expressed the very means of life. Erda is the essence of life, the very source of nature's perenniality. Yet the first human groups had no need of gods. We only begin to hear of them when our human ancestors themselves begin to manipulate nature and the wider earth. Gods are a figment of the agrarian imagination alone. This is most telling, for it speaks both of a kind of mourning, as in the myths concerning paradise, but as well a longing, as expressed in those of Babel. For both narratives here, the effort is to speak not of a place, or even of a time. The one is better rendered as space, and the other predates all history, but rather of a state of being, in existence. This is the primordial womb, and as such, its light and its shadow are at once female. There is no sense of ascent here, as in Goethe's eternal feminine, which lures to perfection. No. What is perfect is what has been in place for eternity, and can only thence be disturbed by the interloper, with his phallic probe entering the depths and enjoining the source to open before his quest. We do not, in fact, find a welcome hearth by any such maneuver, and all the more so in our own time, when nature is herself violated to the point of losing its perennial powers. The presence of mythic narrative which abstracts human actions and relations is itself a sign that we have created a distance, not only amongst ourselves as human comrades, for social contract groups, remember, the next village down the river was not considered to be human at all, but this distance between humanity as a whole and the rest of cosmic creation. This enduring trope carries into our own time with the longing for extraterrestrial contact. We have been alone since the expulsion, and indeed, it is this specific moment of mythic consciousness that is the hallmark of all of the others, from narratives of reunion, as in the Orphic cycle, to those chronicling the deaths of the gods, as in The Ring. The joy of human bonding and the overcoming of divine bondage are themselves intimately of a piece, for it is the conception of what love is and who can thus love, which is at stake. The female figure thus has always been one metaphoric. Nietzsche's use of it as a place marker for truth itself speaks volumes regarding not only his understanding of the idea, but also his witness of womanhood, distantiated, dazzled, diminutive. This too is a mythic trope expressed through other such figures, such as Sophia, the Fates, and the Furies. The Valkyries as well are seen as aloof to entreaty, even while in possession of the deciding vote, the veto regarding life and death. This is the male gaze, observing gestation. He has contributed to the story, but only at the beginning, and thenceforth life takes its earliest course, without either his ken or consent. How could the ultimate wisdom not be that which engenders life itself? Sophia is open to query, but not so much to dialogue. She has no need to risk her being afore a human questioner. The hypermoron, the one who brooks fate itself rather than just mere human custom, is but the flip side of the Promethean figure, who has, though male, managed to give humanity the edge it needs, over against the rest of living nature. And though the gods were rattled by this superlative feat, they themselves were not immediately affected by it. But in ignoring the wisdom of the earth, or that of their own oracular function, the gods eventually placed themselves on the road to annihilation. After 15 or so hours of such machination, it is a decidedly astonishing moment when, in a famous Bayreuth production of Götterdämmerung, we behold a beautiful young woman arise out of the crowd of townsfolk. At the very end of the final scene of Wagner's epic demythology, she is the new Sophia and she is human. The elements are now in place for a new mythology to take hold, that of the revolutionary female youth. The gods are dead, the earth is itself silenced, the forest murmurs, as it were, can no longer even be discerned, let alone deciphered. The male is yet distracted, and thus the first task of the heroine is to truly be the voice of wisdom, drawing him over to contemporary cause. Here is her first question, then. From whence and where does this youthful vision arise? Post-mythic heroic narratives hold the solution. The young woman, naive but not ignorant, inexperienced but not dim-witted, embarks upon a quest which is at once about her being as well as her character. The one is what she is, and thus must consciously become, and the other is who she is, and thus must live with. All conflict in such narratives center around this contrast. The heroine's character is oft at odds with its essence. At first this seems a repetition of the problem of humanity's divorce from nature, but it is, in reality, more of a distant echo. It is a nod to the history of mythology itself, rather than a reiteration of any specific genre of myth. In this, the heroine can come to terms with her own pedigree as both a woman and as a hero, but her first sense of wisdom comes when she realizes that all such ancestry must now be overcome. In doing so, she also discovers that courage is itself value neutral. In the agrarian mythos, dirty deeds come at cost. The hero, in his quest for the truth, allows the abstract good to cover over the actioned evil. Indeed, he tells himself that evil does itself only respond, not to good, but rather just to more of itself, and therefore the entire notion of heroic shadow is laundered thereby. In the narratives of demythology, momentary as they have been, it is the once upholders of truth who fall upon their own swords, soaked to the hilts in the blood of the good. When gods become too human, therein lies their collective demise. But for post-mythic narrative, where it is the heroine who takes center stage, she finds that the old order of once good and once evil no longer applies. This simply must be so, and almost by definition, since both the sources and arbiters of that moral spectrum, also uniquely agrarian, are no longer extant. So at once she is confronted with a wisdom that speaks to her as revolutionary, but as well carries the burdensome implication that revolution does itself entail a reevaluation of all values. And for one, Nietzsche cannot help her, just as the man himself could not help lose Salome, perhaps. This is so because even if the impulse to wisdom has come from reflection and analysis, it still remains for the heroine to act. The second moment of enlightenment, then, is the realization that thought alone cannot change the world. The hero, too, had lived through this moment, but his fight was that of preserving the better part of a world already known. Given this, no matter how rapacious his actual acts became, his was the foreknowing that his goal remained within the truth. Hence the ability of the hero to regain paradise through a baptism of fire, no matter how literal. Eden is guarded by angels with antique, though effective flamethrowers. A ring of fire surrounds Brunhilde's enforced slumber. None may escape the flames of the Dantesque underworld, and our own Promethean gift demands even nature keep its distance. The hero held his fire in his hands, and thence wielded it as a sword of vengeance. Siegfried is the archetype here. Elsewise, he used stealth and canniness to overcome the flame. Here it is Orpheus who is the frame. Or, in a yet more radical movement, the hero turns myth against itself via a living ethics, which annuls human difference. Here it is Jesus who is the model. Yet in each of these narrative types, the male is aware that something of the past must be preserved. Each of these archetypes sacrifices Godhead to conserve love. Siegfried's for Brunhilde and thus justice. Orpheus is for Eurydice and thus redemption. And Jesus is for humanity in general and thus salvation. There would seem to be no more nobler quest. But if love were itself a mythic trope, then at most its reliquary would linger as an ember and not live on as quintessential fire. This is the rumination of the heroine. Love appears to not only be driven by desire, which I myself feel and given over to consistently and willingly, but it also carries within it an idea of what is both good and truthful. Yet, if I admit to love in such whole cloth, am I not reconciling myself to the world as it is, and thus love does itself become but a private reserve? Here, the post-mythic heroine begins to understand that today's love is, and at most can only be, the personalization of paradise. There is only one to whom she can now turn, her sister, from whom she has been estranged, and with whom her relation is shrouded. Yes, her own flesh and blood, but also her ipsissimus shadow, for the sister character in authentically modern narrative is no less than the dark heroine. Hannah Acton in Queen of Hearts and Seraphim Smythe in Kristen Seraphim are the two characters in my own epic fiction who fulfill this crucial role. In regaining intimacy with her sister, the heroine witnesses the truer outcome of demythology itself. The dark heroine not only exists beyond good and evil, she also acts without any such abstract compass, and yet, upon further observation and even participation in her sister's own quest, the heroine sees both method and objective. Perhaps it is the vestigial house cleaning that any world historical shift entails in its incipient regime, but this is both the lesser task, and as well calls to the heroine's mind an ironic appellation of domesticity, as if her sister was but an anti-metaphysical maid service. Certainly there is much action in this pest removal, but there is as well a danger of becoming too enamored thereof, even addicted. Even so, this sequence is necessary to encounter the deeper puzzle. What is it about the heroine herself that needs to be overcome? It is just at this moment that the heroine begins to distinguish her quest from that of her sister. The dark heroine seemingly indwells in vengeance alone. Surely the heroine seeks justice, however radical and novel. Yet it is through the very ruthlessness of her sister's outlook that this new justice begins to take shape. It is no less than a way of being, which is both in history without becoming historical and exists without allowing the existential to dictate its decisions. The heroine does not contemplate death, but rather seeks to understand her own personal death. She does not immerse herself in history, nor yet cleave to its perduring standards, but rather lives as a being who creates its own history. If there is conflict, as there shall surely be, however clean becomes this new house that is me, it is then that the heroine must call upon her dark-souled sibling for advice. And over the course of such narratives, the dark heroine too is transformed, not by the light, for like good and evil, dark and light now have no meaning. There is no light and dark. The one is but the meadows in summer, the other yet the forests in winter. Acton remonstrates Guinevere's half-sister Melissa in Queen of Hearts. But because she, often in spite of herself, wants and needs to love her sister as well as being loved by her, in this furthest realization, the very conception of what love can be, and thus who can love, is also altered. Post-mythic epic narrative authenticates itself in these ways. The lead heroes are female and youthful, the landscape is littered with the shards of godhead, redemption is itself irredeemable, and the action occurs on the way to a revolutionary ethic which no longer perceives the world through an old world lens. In its always penultimate climax, the heroines discover that grace is part of becoming human and is not bestowed upon humanity from any non-human source. That is most important. And this grace is neither vouchsafed by love romantic nor faith ecstatic, but rather by an ad hoc compassion and an enduring friendship, the two forms of love which have shadowed our ideals without apprenticing themselves to them. May we ourselves gain this sibling bond wherein the day can finally seize itself.